Welcome to episode 21 of Killer Stories. I'm your host, Bobbie Holmes. I've been trying to eat healthier lately and staying away from fast food restaurants, but we all have our favorites. I have a hard time choosing between Wendy's and Chick-fil-A. McDonald's is by far the most popular chain, bringing in over $40 billion in 2019. McDonald's was number one in the late 70s as well. Second most popular, Burger Chef. Burger Chef was a little different. You could order your burger with or without. With meaning pre-built with lettuce, tomato, onion. Without was served plain, allowing you to finish building your own burger at the Works Bar. I'm usually a drive-through person, but if I were dining in, I think I would like that. At least then I would know my toppings aren't going to be all lopsided. How is it that I've never even heard of Burger Chef? Probably because I'm from a really small town where the only choice was Burger King. But also because in 1982, they started selling each of its 1,050 locations to Hardee's. The last Burger Chef closed in 1996. Are you wondering why I'm schooling you on fast food restaurants? It's because this week's case involves Burger Chef employees. It's an unsolved case. Actually, not just one murder, it's a quadruple homicide, dubbed the Burger Chef murders. This story takes place in 1978 in Speedway, Indiana, the city that is home to the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. The residents of Speedway felt like it was a pretty safe place to live, but in the late 70s, there was an abnormal amount of crime. On July 29, 1978, the doorbell rang at the Cyphers house. 65-year-old Julia answers the door. A man with shaggy long hair said he wanted a second look at a china set she recently had at their yard sale. Julia walked the man into her garage to show him the set, and he shot her in the head. Her husband, 68-year-old Fred, heard the shot and came running. By the time he got there, he saw the man pulling out of the driveway. He unfortunately didn't have many details from what he saw. Some believe this murder was planned within the family. There was turmoil between Julia and her daughter, but the case went unsolved. In September of that year, there were 8 bombs detonated across the city. The first 3 were placed into trash cans. Although it frightened many people, no one was injured. A week later, 2 more bombs were detonated in the same way. The very next day, there was an explosion at a local bowling alley. The day after that, a bomb was placed underneath a police car. Luckily, that police officer had the day off and was not inside when it detonated. The last bomb was placed inside of a gym bag underneath of a car in the high school parking lot during a football game. A man named Carl DeLong spotted the bag and walked over to it. You know when you're in an airport and they make the announcement to report any bags left unattended? There's a reason. Given that the past few days were full of bombings, Carl probably should have just called the police. But instead, he walks over to the gym bag and starts kicking it. The bomb detonated, causing enough damage that his right leg needed to be amputated. His wife was also injured in the blast. On September 20th, police arrested 27-year-old Brett Kimberlin for the bombings. He was tracked down by the items he purchased to make the bombs. The store clerk that sold him the items was able to describe him to a T. Incriminating evidence was found in his apartment and the case was closed. Even though the bomber was now behind bars, the past few months had everyone in Speedway on edge. At the Burger Chef restaurant on Crawfordsville Road in Speedway, the employees were dropping like flies. 20-year-old Jane Freet had worked hard the past few years climbing the ladder and earning the assistant manager position. When one of her employees, 18-year-old Ruth Shelton, tried to put in her 2 weeks' notice, Jane convinced her to stay and help through the holidays before she quit. Ruth was feeling overwhelmed with school, work, the current events, but she didn't want to let down her friends at the Burger Chef. She agreed to stay for a few more weeks. 16-year-old Mark Flemons didn't typically work the night shift, but on Friday, November 17th, he was covering a shift for a coworker named Ginger. The closing crew that night was assistant manager Jane, Ruth, Mark, and 16-year-old Daniel Davis. The restaurant closed at 11 p.m. and the crew began cleaning up and taking out the trash while Jane counted the day's profits. Around midnight, a fellow employee was driving by and pulled into the Burger Chef. He stopped to say hi and help with closing if needed. But he immediately knew something was off. The back door was unlocked. The cash register was hanging open. The only thing left inside was change. He noticed that Jane and Ruth's jacket and purse were still hanging up in the break room. Girls don't go places without their purse. He called 911 and reported his findings. The police didn't take it very seriously. After all, this was a group of teenagers. They assumed that they were the ones behind the missing money and used it to buy party supplies. Not like streamers and party hats, as in drugs and alcohol. The officer literally said he wouldn't be surprised if he came across them later that night getting into trouble. But Jane was a responsible manager. Even if she did take the money and the group left, she would have at the very least shut the cash register, turned off the lights, and locked the door. The police cryptically called the parents of Mark Flemons and asked if he had come home yet. His father said no, he was still at work. The officer then said to let him know if Mark returned home. They didn't tell him his child was missing, which is just awful. He's 16. But his parents aren't stupid and figured out that something wasn't right. Mark should have been home by now. The Flemons drove down to the station for some answers. This prompted the police to inform the other parents of their missing children. The morning crew at Burger Chef showed up to work and got the okay to open for the day. The closing crew did not finish cleaning the night before, so the morning crew cleaned everything, wiped all surfaces, eliminating any possible evidence or DNA left behind. And because the cops downplayed the situation, they didn't dust for prints or take any photos of the Burger Chef before it was cleaned. When Jane's Chevy Vega was found parked in town with the passenger door unlocked, the police finally admitted that something shady must have happened. They also realized they messed up big time, allowing a crime scene to be cleaned. This mistake is probably the reason that this case is still unsolved. But there wasn't any blood noted. This was being treated as a robbery and abduction. The thought was that somebody left the door propped open while taking out the trash. That allowed the perpetrator or perpetrators to enter the building. It's been known for robberies to occur at closing time at fast food restaurants. The place is empty and the money is already out being counted. However, nothing like that ever happened in Speedway. If money was all they wanted, why abduct the employees? unless one of the robbers was recognized. Mark worked at a different burger chef and was transferred to the one in Speedway. He wasn't supposed to be working that night. There's a theory that a burger chef employee from another restaurant came to rob the place, but Mark recognized him. He panicked, abducting Jane, Ruth, Daniel, and Mark. This is just a theory. No evidence to support it. But then again, there is no evidence at all. Investigators interviewed witnesses who were near the burger chef around this time. A teenage couple was hanging out on the railroad tracks. The burger chef restaurant was visible from where they stood. They told police that two men approached them and told them it wasn't safe to be out so late with all the crime that's been happening in Speedway and they should head home. When they left, they cut through the burger chef parking lot. They reported that Jane's white Chevy Vega was still parked there at this time. They described the two men in their 30s. Both were white, one taller with a beard, the other clean-shaven with light-colored hair. This kind of goes against the burger chef employee theory. Most of the employees were teenagers or in their early 20s. Instead of having a normal sketch artist, police had an art student mold faces out of clay to depict the perpetrators. I've never heard of that being done before. Another interesting choice by the investigators, they asked the witnesses if they were open to being hypnotized to try to gather more information. Maybe they were desperate to make up for the fact that they screwed this case up from the get-go. Tips were called in from other witnesses. One teenager said he was stopped at a red light and saw a car in the burger chef parking lot. He said the man in the driver's seat had a beard and the rear windows were all fogged up. Two other tips called in from residents who lived on Lupine Drive. They reported two cars driving fast. Neither had their lights on, and one was a two-toned van. Initially, investigators thought they had piled all four employees into Jane's Chevy Vega. I know cars were like boats back then, but if there were two men and four employees, that's a tight squeeze. After the sightings of the van, police now believe that two vehicles were used. At this point, the missing employees were all over the news. The crimes happened on a Friday night. On Sunday afternoon, a couple went for a walk in the woods behind their house, a rural area about 20 miles outside of Speedway. On their walk, they found the missing employees, all still wearing their burger chef uniforms, lying dead in the woods. The couple called the police immediately. Jane had been stabbed twice in the chest. The blade of the knife was still inside her. The handle had broken off and was not recovered. Daniel and Ruth were shot with a .38 caliber handgun. They were shot execution style multiple times. Ruth was a religious girl. She always carried her Bible with her. Her body was in a position as if she had been praying when she was shot. Mark's body was found separate from the other three, 163 feet away. The autopsy showed that his head was bludgeoned with what seemed like a metal chain. But his actual cause of death was from choking on his own blood. The coroner had a theory that he was trying to run away. It was a possibility that he could have tripped and hit his head, knocking him unconscious. The men, assuming he was dead, just left him. They thought that Mark may have survived if he had landed in a different position. If this was a robbery gone wrong, it's strange that all 4 victims had money in their wallets. They were still wearing their watches and their jewelry. You would think the robbers would have taken those things as well. Police called the parents of the victims and asked them to meet them at the station. The poor choice of verbiage used was, "We found your children," which makes it sound like they were found alive. The parents rushed down to the police station to be told that they found the bodies of their children. I feel like I would rather have just been told the whole truth over the phone. They were given false hope and then completely devastated and heartbroken when told the details at the station. The FBI was called in to help investigate the murders. Outside of blood from the victims, there was no evidence left behind in the woods where they were found either. The coroner report stated that the victims were killed around 3 a.m. Initially, all police had to go off of was the witness accounts of the bearded and the clean-shaven men. Because of where the victims were found, in the boonies of Indiana, police believed the perpetrators knew the area well. Burger Chef was offering a $25,000 reward for any information about the slaying. Months went by before there were reports of a man in a neighboring town bar that would regularly brag about his involvement in the murders. Police questioned him and gave him a polygraph, which he passed. The man was just blowing smoke. But the lead wasn't a complete failure. He gave the police names of a fast food robbery gang. I know that sounds ridiculous, but I swear I was a victim of a daycare center robbery gang. There's a group of people who work together to steal purses out of cars in daycare parking lots. The credit and debit cards are then dispersed, and whoever looks most like the ID would attempt to withdraw money from the bank. The local police here said it's been going on for a long time, and they haven't caught them because they're always driving a different vehicle. Also, because my daycare won't put up cameras in the parking lot. They don't think that will deter crime. Maybe not, but it would possibly help catch the people doing it. Can you tell I'm still a bit salty over the situation? A woman attempted to withdraw money from the drive-thru teller using my card and ID, which I had reported stolen immediately. The teller called the police, and when the woman realized something wasn't right, she literally abandoned the car and ran away on foot. It was a rental car, and they had used some other person's stolen credit card and name to rent it. So I have no doubt that the fast food robbery gang was a real thing. It seems like people go to great lengths to avoid getting a real job and earning their own money. Back to 1978. When police were following up on that lead, they found a man that resembled the description of the bearded man. They called him in for a lineup to hopefully be identified by the couple who saw him that night. But guess what? The dude shaved his beard. He had a beard for 5 years, and he shaved it right before coming in for a lineup. Now that sounds pretty sketchy to me. There was another guy that fit the clean-shaven, light-haired man description. And he was literally arrested for robbing other fast food restaurants. To me, it sounds like they have their men. But neither man would confess to the robbery or the killings. And not to beat a dead horse, but there was no evidence. Police were not able to make an arrest without a confession. Further investigation into the victims proved they may not have been as innocent as portrayed. Tips were called in about drugs being sold in the Burger Chef bathrooms. While Jane was probably unaware, and sweet little religious Ruth, I'm sure, had no involvement, Mark Flemons was involved. Mark told a friend the night before he died that he owed a drug dealer $7,000. And this is in 1978. That is a lot of money for a 16-year-old to be in debt with a drug dealer. His friend said he may have exaggerated about what he owed, but Mark was definitely scared. Not long after the murders, Jane's brother James was arrested on a drug charge. They brought him in for questioning. Not necessarily because they thought he was the murderer, but they wanted to know if Jane had a history with drugs like him. The autopsy showed that she had trace amounts of marijuana in her system. Guess what? It's the 70s. It would probably be hard to find someone that didn't have marijuana in their system. James was adamant that Jane would have nothing to do with the buying or selling of drugs at Burger Chef. He said she took her job very seriously. He was the screw-up in the family, not her. The case went cold until 1984 when an interesting phone call came from an inmate at the Pendleton Correctional Facility. The inmate's name was Donald Forrester. Hi, so I'm in the middle of editing this episode right now, and I've noticed that the whole second half of this episode, I am talking about Donald Forrester, and I'm saying Ronald. So when you hear Ronald, what I mean is Donald. Sorry, I'm an idiot. He was serving time for rape and was about to be transferred to the Indiana State Prison, which is known for being a very violent place. Rapists probably don't get treated very well. He was calling to make a confession to his involvement in the Burger Chef murders. In exchange, he wanted to avoid the transfer. At this point, there are no other leads, so police brought Forrester in to hear his confession. He said he was the one responsible for shooting Daniel and Ruth. He took the police to the woods where the bodies were found and had described the scene accurately. Donald talked about the fact that the handle was missing from the knife used to stab Jane, which was not a fact that the public knew about. He told police that Jane's brother James owed their dealer quite a bit of money. Donald and 3 others went to the Burger Chef that night to threaten Jane. Mark interfered to protect Jane, which caused a fight. During the fight, Mark fell and hit his head on the bumper of the car. The men thought Mark was dead. The other 3 employees were now witnesses to a murder, so they abducted and killed them. Ronald took police to a spot by the river where he claimed to have thrown the firearm used to shoot Daniel and Ruth. The river was searched, but the murder weapon was never recovered. Not surprising, this was 6 years later. Investigators interviewed Ronald's ex-wife. She told them that after the murders, Ronald drove to a remote area in the woods and parked the car. He instructed her to stay in the car and returned a moment later with shell casings. Once they got back home, he flushed them down the toilet. Neither Ronald or his ex-wife lived at that house any longer, but police got a warrant to search the septic tank. They actually recovered a few shell casings from a .38 caliber. Ronald's story seemed to be holding up. This case is finally going to get some closure. But suddenly, Ronald recanted his confession. He said he was coerced. While it seemed like he knew a lot about the murders, maybe he was fed that information. There wasn't any evidence linking him to the crimes, The shell casings couldn't be used as evidence because they didn't have the murder weapon. Without a confession, they have nothing. Ronald remained tight-lipped. He died of cancer in 2006. What the hell happened that night? Was it a botched robbery? An attempt to collect a debt? Was it the bearded man and his clean-shaven friend? Or was it Ronald Forrester and his 3 accomplices? At first, I thought for sure it was the guy who shaved his beard and his clean-shaven friend that was then arrested for robbing fast food restaurants. We don't even know the names of these men because they were never formally listed as suspects. Forrester sure knew a lot of details that only the killer would know. 42 years later, and the case still remains unsolved. I want to hear your theories. Jump on my social media and tell me what you think happened. You'll find me on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok at Killer Stories Podcast. My Twitter handle is at Killer Stories PC. Email for story suggestions is killerstoriespodcast@gmail.com. If you're enjoying this podcast, show your support by buying me a beer. I might actually treat myself to a drink, but the donations are used to help cover the cost to keep up with production. Go to buymeacoffee.com/killerstories for a one-time donation and tell me how I'm doing. I would also love it if you could leave me a review on Apple Podcasts. The sources used for today's episode can be found listed on the show notes. As always, thanks for listening. Until next time, this has been a killer story.